When Christmas comes, there's a few things I can definitely count on. One thing for sure are puzzles. There's a part of my family that loves putting out large puzzles on a very large table, and they try to put it all together before the dinner has been served. And they all have a different strategy for how you put the pieces together. Do you try to find the flat edges to get the periphery done? Do you look for the center picture and try and work from the inside out? Puzzles are fun until you're puzzled with something in real life. I want to talk today about the qualifications for an elder. Now you might be saying, why would we be talking about qualifications for an elder when we're supposed to be talking about the lives of elders? Well, because the qualifications actually are a list of character references, benchmarks, elements of their life that enable them to lead and guide the flock. And as we try to piece the list from 1 Timothy, Titus, and 1 Peter together, it's like putting together a puzzle. And if we were going to try to figure out what's at the center, what is it that links all of them, we'd have to say it is the idea of blamelessness, to be above reproach, to be an example to the flock. That is an item listed at the very top in all three accounts. We have to have the reputation, the character of blamelessness. I remember working with a church that was trying to appoint new leaders. And we had vetted, and we had worked, and we had come up with a list, and we had talked to them, trained them, and now we were presenting them to the congregation. And I remember sitting in the back of the church as the first name was called off as one of our new elder candidates. And there was some conversation. There were people applauding. I could see people nodding and smiling. And then the second name, and the same response. And the third name. But then the fourth name was read off. And there was dead silence, followed by a sudden gasp of air from the congregation. Almost so much, I wanted to see if the back doors of the congregation were actually bowing inward. Obviously, whoever this was, however much vetting we had done, their reputation, their character within the congregation was in question. You see, the essential quality of an elder is to be blameless, above reproach, an example to all. And by the way, this example has to be not only within the congregation, but also outside the congregation. We have to be concerned with how people are perceived both in and also to those who are not believers. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul talks to the Corinthian church about a sin in the midst of the church. And when he characterizes it, he says, this is a sin so grievous, even the pagans don't do it. In other words, you have something going on in the church that's not only wrong here, it's even wrong out there. And so when we talk about a church leader, their character has to be exemplary both in the community of the faith and outside the faith community. What kind of reputation does this person have? Because we start becoming concerned about the leadership qualities, before we get into the lists themselves, we have to look at the list from the helicopter perspective. We have to ask ourselves a few questions about the list themselves. Before we ever pay attention to what's in them, there are a few precursors that we have to address, such as we need to seek out the proper meaning of the list. What does it mean to be hospitable? What does it mean not given too much alcohol? What does it mean when there's an item on the list? What did it mean to the original reader, and what was Paul's intent? So we have to decide that we're going to let the text speak for itself. Secondly, we have to ask ourselves the question, do we consistently apply all the qualifications? Consistently. Do we lift one qualification and say, well, they have to have done this for their entire life or they're disqualified? And then lift up another one and say, he's done that for a while. He's done that for a few weeks. He's good. We just simply have to be consistent on how we apply each of the items. I think we also need to ask the important question, how does this individual item on the list relate back to that concept of blamelessness? Because after all, if that's the central concept, does it not make sense that every item on that list is going to somehow define and describe what it means to be above reproach? What God expects us to be as an example to His flock. So we have to relate everything back to the idea of blamelessness. We also have to ask ourselves the question, does this have to apply to their pre-Christian life? What if one of the qualifications wasn't met before they were a Christian? What if they're a Hindu who converts to Christianity, obviously has not upheld the truth of the gospel for their entire life? They started as a Hindu. Do we hold that against them? By the way, what if they were a thief before becoming a Christian? Does this now disqualify them years later at being a leader in the church? Good question. Another issue to face is this. What if the person had a biblically acceptable reason for the item in question? I'm oftentimes asked, what does it mean to be the husband of one wife? Some people think that has to do with divorce. That's a possibility. But what if the divorce occurred for a biblical reason? One that God Himself even stipulates. Can we then say this excludes that person from being an elder? Once again, I'm saying these are questions you have to wrestle with before even delving into the list itself. Because we want to treat the list fairly. I will say this, if you were to pull up all three lists, you would see at the top, the first thing mentioned, blameless, above reproach, an example to the flock. It is only one of two qualifications that is mentioned in all three lists. You may ask, what is the second one? All three lists talk about being able to handle money correctly. It involves the financial life of the individual and of the church. But now that we've got blamelessness as the centerpiece, and we look at the myriad of lists and words to describe the character of an elder, how do we make sense of it? I'd like to suggest that when we look at the list, it falls into four areas of blamelessness. First off, we are blameless before God. When I assess my relationship with the Almighty, how do I assess it? Am I blameless before Him? I love 1 Peter chapter 5, who says, you are shepherds of God's flock, but you're going to receive the approval of the chief shepherd when He returns. Are we living a life that we get the approval of the chief shepherd? That's the question. Have I theological integrity to what I am doing? Am I teaching and upholding and protecting doctrine the way I ought to? Is my life upright and holy, reflecting Christ in every avenue, both inside the church and outside the church? By the way, Paul says he can't be a recent convert, so obviously they have to be spiritually mature. Their relationship with God has to have had some time to grow. And for this reason, they can say, I am blameless before the Lord. There are qualifications that deal with that type of blamelessness. Another area of blamelessness is to be blameless before others, in our relationships with others, both in the church and in the community. By the way, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7, Paul writes, he must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. You see, if he is really going to lead and serve others, he has to have a good reputation among them. If he is going to be the servant leader, they have to know him, he has to know them, and there has to be a level of trust and relationship. There has to be. And that relationship has to be blameless. Why? Because elders sometimes have to lead through difficult times. Elders have to lead through situations of conflict, situations of decision, of challenge. And when they stand up before the congregation, it is one thing to be blameless before God, but you also have to have the trust of the people you serve and lead, and therefore blameless before others. Another element of blamelessness is to be blameless before the family. How many qualifications for elder has to do with family? First, it says he has to be the husband of one wife, faithful to his wife, a man of good character where women are concerned. It talks about an elder has to have believing children, children who are obedient to the faith, who, by the way, have such behavior that they're not open to charges of being wild or disobedient. And therefore, his family becomes blameless. The simple fact is, an orderly life in the family gives stability and balance to enable them to lead. And so if when the elder stands up, nobody points their finger at his family and says, don't you know what your children are like? Don't you know what your wife is like? Or worse, goes to your wife and says, don't you know what your husband is like? There has to be blamelessness within the family. And finally, blamelessness before yourself. When you look in the mirror, when you're alone, when you have that dark night of the soul where it is just you and God, and you feel perhaps a little shut off, even from Him. I'm not talking about loving yourself in a narcissistic way or an egocentric way. But when you look in the mirror, do you see the child of God He meant you to be? Do you see your identity captured by Christ? He says this in several ways in the text, where he simply talks about one's view of themselves. Do you do a review of your own life so that you can say, I am blameless before all, including myself? Now, by the way, I have talked to an eldership that when I asked them about the qualifications, they gave an interesting answer that was amazing. They said, we don't feel like each individual elder fulfills the entire list of requirements, but as a body of elders, as a group of elders, we embody it. You see, in God's wisdom, He didn't say appoint an elder. He said elders, plural. That elders were appointed over the church. Paul told Titus to appoint elders, plural, over the church. And when we realized that we were supposed to be a piece of a puzzle that connects to another piece, we're not serving alone. Just like a puzzle piece has some strengths and some weaknesses, has extensions and has gaps, we fill one another's weakness with our strength. we come together to complete the entire picture. And so it's important for us to understand that we don't serve alone. We serve on an elder team. So it's important to realize that you're not the only one qualified to be an elder. There are others in the congregation just as qualified. Second, no one elder possesses the entire quality of blamelessness. But as an eldership, you do. As an elder team, it describes you in community. And third, we need to exercise our servant leadership, realizing we didn't earn the position of elder. We didn't politic for the position of elder. It's not something we attained by our own effort, but rather, as 1 Peter says, we serve not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be. As God wants you to be. And you see, when we put all the puzzle pieces together and learn to serve as a whole, we lead well.